Hey everyone, and welcome. Bet you didn't think you'd be taking a deep dive into Uber today, huh? It's kind of wild how this company, a company so many of us use, well, it's practically everywhere you look now. You guys sent in a ton of interesting stuff, articles, of course, but some of you even shared your own notes on their pricing strategies and stuff. Oh, and someone even dug up a thread on Reddit, you know, from drivers talking about their experiences. So today, let's break it all down. Uber, how they went from 0 to 100 in basically no time, becoming this global, well, I don't even know what to call it, empire. But also we got to talk about the rough stuff, the controversies along the way.
It's interesting because when you think about it, Uber's like a textbook example of what they call disruptive innovation. They didn't just make a taxi app, they basically reinvented the rules of the game for an entire industry.
Totally. And get this, the whole thing started because the founders, Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp, they're in Paris, right? And they can't find a cab. That's it. That's the origin story. Proof that sometimes the best ideas come from, pure frustration.
Well, that and good timing. I mean, they launched in 2010 when smartphones and GPS were blowing up perfect storm for a company built on connecting riders and drivers instantly.
And talk about being in the right place at the right time. They launched in San Francisco. I was reading an Economist article that called The Conference, where Uber first got its start. It's called Lee Web. Well, they called it a place where revolutionaries gather to plot the future. Sounds kind of dramatic, but you got to admit, they weren't wrong.
Launching in San Francisco was strategic for sure. It wasn't just about being in a tech hub. It was about tapping into that early adopter mentality. The people who are always the first to try new gadgets, new apps. Uber knew those were the people they needed to win over first, and it worked.
It's crazy. They went from literally three cars,
Yeah.
to taking over the world.
And that's where the magic triangle model comes in. They didn't just grow randomly. They were very deliberate. They focused on who their customers were, what they could offer that was different, and crucially, how they were going to make money. And, you actually pointed this out in your notes about their pricing. That's a big piece of that puzzle.
Oh, yeah. I mean, their surge pricing, it's controversial for sure, but it's a direct result of that whole magic triangle thinking. Control supply and demand, maximize profit, even if it means riders sometimes end up paying a premium.
Exactly. They were willing to challenge the status quo, and that extended beyond just ride-hailing. Pretty soon, they branched out to food delivery with Uber Eats, then freight transport, even those electric scooters you see everywhere now.
Talk about covering all your bases.
Yeah.
By 2023, they were in over 10,000 cities, 700 plus airports. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah.
Starting with just 3 cars. And now they're doing something like 23 million trips a day. That's not just a company anymore. It's like a force of nature.
And they got there by focusing on cities, especially those big metropolitan areas, and by, let's face it, being really aggressive with their marketing. They were throwing around driver incentives, giving out discounts to riders like it was nothing, all to grab market share. And, well, it worked.
They definitely wrote the book on rapid growth, that's for sure. But, and there's always a but, right? No success story comes without its, let's call them learning experiences. And with Uber, some of those were more major crashes.
Yeah, and that's often the price of disruption, right? It's not always pretty. Uber's story, I mean, it's full of these big, messy questions about ethics, about the law, and frankly, they haven't always come out looking great.
It's true. We can't talk about Uber without talking about, well, some of the more controversial stuff. The self-driving car accidents, for one, those raised some huge red flags about safety. Then there were those stories about their work culture. Not good. And who could forget that whole kill switch thing, where they basically blocked access to their data. These aren't just PR problems. They make you wonder if there are deeper issues going on.
Absolutely. Think about that kill switch for a second. I remember you were highlighting concerns about data privacy in those notes you shared. And that incident, it just throws gasoline on the fire. Suddenly you're talking about transparency, about who has the power when it comes to tech companies and the government. It gets complicated really fast.
No kidding. And then there's the whole gig economy debate, which I know you were interested in unpacking. The fact that Uber drivers are classified as independent contractors, not employees, that has massive implications.
Huge. Remember those driver stories you shared from that Reddit thread? Reading those, it really hits home that this isn't just some abstract business model. We're talking about people's lives. Some drivers love the flexibility, being their own boss, all that. But then you have others talking about the downsides, like inconsistent pay, no benefits, feeling like they're always hustling just to get by. It paints a pretty complicated picture.
It's like suddenly the human cost of this whole thing becomes impossible to ignore. It makes you think, who's looking out for these drivers?
Yeah.
Who's responsible for making sure they're treated fairly in this new economy?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And it feeds into this bigger conversation we're having as a society about the future of work, especially with platforms like Uber becoming more and more common. But hey, maybe we should shift gears for a bit. I'm curious to dig into how Uber became so, well, ubiquitous in the first place. Because you got to hand it to them, their marketing, it's been masterful.
Totally. It's kind of weird, right? They're this multi-billion-dollar company, but they still managed to give off this vibe of like this scrappy startup that's all about word of mouth and connecting with everyday people.
Oh, it's deliberate, trust me. Remember those early referral programs? Give someone a free ride, they get their friends hooked, next thing you know, everyone's using Uber. They tapped into that whole idea of social currency, of turning satisfied customers into their best marketing tool way before it was a thing.
They made it cool to ride with Uber, it's true. And let's be real, their service did make getting around a lot easier, at least in cities. Which is why I think those driver stories are so interesting. Hearing it from the people actually doing the driving, it gives you a whole different perspective.
For sure. They positioned themselves as the answer to a real problem, and at least early on, they delivered. But they've never been afraid to experiment, to try new things, and that's where things get even more interesting, especially when you start looking at their financials.
Speaking of, I'm glad you flagged those Uber financials in my research stack. On the surface, it's like, boom, huge revenue. But then you look closer and you see those consistent losses year after year. Makes you wonder if this whole thing is sustainable in the long run, especially with all the money they're pouring into expansion and those other ventures like Uber Elevate.
It's a high-risk, high-reward game they're playing. Only time will tell if it works out for them. Of course, it helps that they've managed to attract massive investments, like those deals with Google Ventures and the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. We're talking billions of dollars here, which has definitely kept them going.
But that kind of money comes with strings attached, right? And then you factor in the competition heating up, not to mention inflation hitting everyone these days. It's like they're constantly trying to stay one step ahead of the game.
It's a balancing act, that's for sure, and the future is anything but certain.
And then there's Uber Elevate, right? Like flying taxis, it's straight out of science fiction. I mean, it's cool to think about, but is that really going to be a thing? Or is it just a distraction from everything else they've got going on?
It's ambitious, that's for sure. And you bring up a good point. It's not just about the technology. You've got regulations. You've got to figure out the whole infrastructure thing. Where do these things even land? And then there's the whole, are people going to trust flying taxis?
Yeah, haven't they seen enough sci-fi movies to know that never ends well?
Right. But hey, maybe they'll pull it off. Though we haven't even touched on the environmental impact of, a zillion flying cars. Seems like every time Uber takes a step forward, a whole bunch of new questions pop up.
It's like they're a case study in the law of unintended consequences or something.
It's true, though. Pushing boundaries, it forces us to have these conversations, right? About what really matters, what we're willing to risk, the kind of future we want to live in. It's not always comfortable.
Almost like Uber's become this mirror, reflecting our own, anxieties about technology. We want the convenience, the shiny new toys, but we're also kind of scared of what might happen.
Exactly. And that's what makes their story so fascinating, even with all the messiness, the contradictions. They're forcing us to take a long, hard look at our relationship with technology, and it's not always pretty.
It definitely makes you think, that's for sure. And it doesn't feel like the story's over yet, not even close.
Okay.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's your big takeaway? What sticks with you after all this? The sheer scale of what they've built. The ethical questions they've raised. Because really, when you think about it, their story is also our story. We're the users, the drivers, the ones who ultimately decide whether Uber is a force for good or, something else entirely. So, what do you think?